Hello everybody, hope you're doing marvelously well. As ever, please subscribe. There should be a link down here somewhere. Hit that notification bell and you'll be notified when we have a new video. And of course, you can go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list, get a whole bunch of free goodies. And of course, you can try out the Academy, which is a wonderful place with an incredible community that is really supportive. Okay, it's another FAQ Friday, a frequently asked questions. Let's get going. If you're using a kick sample to avoid actually placing the sample manually for every kick hit, is there a program or method you use that the sample you're working with lines up with each kick hit? Yes, there's a couple of different things. If you're using just generic samples, like, you know, you're not using Addictive or Easy Drummer or Superior or Slate Trigger, if you're not using one of those, and you're just manually placing them in Pro Tools, you use what is called Sound Replacer. And I think you can, I believe, top of my head, you can use 3 different samples and load them in there. And then you can blend them. And what that does is that reads the peaks and troughs. It reads the, attenuation of the volume of every single one of those kicks and then replicates it. So that when you put your kick in, it will line it up to that place and also keep the dynamics of each of those kick drums. For instance, I personally do a bit of both. I will manually put things in and I will line it up. I do find whatever software you use, within reason, there's always, not always, but more often than not, a missed trigger. It's just the way it is. You might have a random bleed from another drum. The guy or girl might be hitting the floor tom at the same time as the kick, and there's a weird kind of like double flamming of the low end, so the kick doesn't know where to trigger from. For instance, there's many tricks in Pro Tools, and I'm sure I'd love to know what other people do with Reaper and Studio One and Cubase and all the other great, Ableton, all the other great DAWs out there. But in Pro Tools, for instance, you can strip the silence, which means you can remove the stuff between all of the transients on the kick drum. That also helps with the triggering. So you create a playlist of the kick drum, strip all of the stuff in between, and then only use the transients themselves from the kick drum to trigger in Sound Replacer. However, there's a million different ways of doing it. You can use Melodyne to capture MIDI information and then use that in Addictive. Then other softwares have that already built in. I know that DAWs have that built in. Let's have a discussion. Everybody, let me know what you use. Let us all know what DAW you use and how you do drum replacing. Is it better to edit and mix songs with headphones connected to your PC or to your interface? Is there a big difference? Wow, this is, I think we're moving into the incredibly contentious waters here. I love interfaces. I use all kinds of different ones. I'm blessed to have over in my rack over here, which you can't see unfortunately, but I'll tell you, there is an Apogee, there is a 192, believe it or not, an old one. We have Avid, Apogee, and Lavery, and then I use Audient. I use a lot of different Audients. I have the ID4, the ID14. We also have the 44, which we're about to try out soon, so watch that. Why am I talking about this? Well, they all have different roles for me. The smaller Audients have mic pre's built into them and they're really fast and easy to use. I plug them into a laptop or a studio computer. We do a quick overdub. When we are doing the streaming mixes, we are monitoring through the Audient. Okay. This is where it gets contentious. Is it better than using the computer's sound card? There are so many experts. I'm not an expert. I'm just like you. I do this for a living. I'm blessed, but I'm not an expert. I don't quote numbers. I don't spend my life researching stats. I have to go on how I feel about things, how they work. I do often take out the 1/8 inch output from my computer and plug it into the console and play through speakers. And I've listened to mixes through that way. I've listened to iTunes, Spotify, you name it, I've all done through that. I've also done the same thing through the Audient. It seems to me the biggest change is not the output. You can please disagree with me down here and give me the reasons why I'm wrong. That isn't as big of a difference. For me, the biggest reason why I use an independent audio interface is predominantly because of the mic pre's that are on the Audient. It's a little box this big, the ID4, and I can plug into that mic pre and I like the way it sounds. The monitoring I have done several times straight off of my computer sound card, and I found it to be very, very functional. When I mix on a laptop, plug my headphones into the laptop. Now, is it as good as the interface? Probably spec-wise, no, not as good. So given the choice, I would probably use an external I/O. Here's the rub. If you don't have an I/O and you want to mix tracks, please don't worry about it. Just get started, get working. This is where I think it's really important that we give the right message to everybody. If you're working on a laptop and you don't have an interface and you only have the output from the headphones, then please, by all means, use that and get making music. If you do have access to the interface, then use it. What's great about the interface is not only the possibility that it might have better converters in it, obviously, it's a dedicated interface. It's more about the fact that it's got a big volume control on it. Plugged in over the moment, so I can't bring it out. But the Audient, for instance, has a big volume control. It's easy to use. It makes my life easier. There's other advantages as well. But this all comes down to don't stop making music because you don't have these particular pieces of equipment. Because the reality is, whether you have an expensive mic or a cheap mic, an expensive interface or no interface, if you've got a way to get sound in and out of your computer, I'd much rather you went and did that than worried about what a guy like me or anybody else's opinion might be. So if your question is really about whether you need to buy the interface, yes, the reason for buying interfaces are really good. If it's overusing a sound card on a computer, but if it's stopping you from making music, please don't do that. Just get making music. What if you only have a backing track and not the actual vocal? How would you mix it while still leaving space for the vocal? Marvelous question. Really, really good question. I would say do not slam your master bus. As simple as that. If you're going to print an instrumental track, which is a blob of limited music, if it's just literally a huge blob of EDM, hit you over the head, rock and roll, pop, metal, whatever it might be, there is no room for the vocal. If you let it breathe, gentle compression, some EQ without massive limiting, you're going to have plenty of room left for your vocal. These days, instrumental tracks tend to be very dense, even, with the vocal muted, even with the vocal mixed in, then muted, I should say. So the reality is like, just make sure you leave enough headroom in there to mix the vocal, and then apply any additional EQ compression and limiting on the master bus after the vocal is in there. So if you're sending an instrumental track for somebody to mix a vocal into, which I presume is what you're asking, leave headroom in the track for them to mix the vocal in, and then they can do their own compression, EQ, and limiting on their master bus. How do you set the volume of multiple pieces of equipment, such as your computer versus monitor, speakers versus audio interface? Do you set your monitors and computer to 100% and use the interface as the master volume? Yes. I mean, basically, yes. I use the interface, either working on the console or working on the little ID4 or ID14. I use that as the master control. It's just easier. My headphones, as we were talking about earlier, are usually plugged into either the interface or to the console when I'm using, the Avid, the Apogee, or the Lavry interfaces, and they're coming back through the console. I'm monitoring off the console headphone output. Otherwise, like you, if I'm working on my little ID4 or ID14, we're monitoring off of that. Now, I understand what you're saying. If you have multiple sources and there are massive imbalances, you might be cranking to listen to something off of your computer, and then you play your track back, which is limited and crushed and whatever, and might blow your head off. So if you are, and you do have to move between multiple sources, then you may have to balance your volumes. However, I would probably suggest the best solution is, if you're going to a track from another source, import it into your session. So let's just say you have a mix session and you're referencing things. Rather than going in and opening up iTunes every single time to play it back, or Spotify, take that track and put it into your session. Then you can solo it in your track. Then you can solo that track in your session, and it's infinitely easier to keep the volumes the same. That's basically what we do. We'll have reference tracks in there, the demo in there, the previous mixes all available. so we're not changing mediums all the time. But to directly answer your question, yes, the interface or the console is where we're adjusting our volumes. Should I edit first and then align and check phase on all the tracks, or align and fix any phase issues and then do all my edits? I would definitely start with everything in phase, sounding absolutely amazing before I started getting editing happy. If you're going to do any adjustments to the tracks for phase alignment, do them first and then edit afterwards. You don't want to get in a situation where you have stuff, especially if it's unconsolidated and then you're trying to move stuff around. I would just, because the thing is you might go back to a previous playlist and have half of the stuff edited and half of them not. You might take whole sections that are different. So just take your playlist, duplicate the whole of your drum track, for instance, duplicate it so you have an unedited, unmessed with, no phase alignment software or whatever. Then with that duplicate track, then do whatever you want to do. If you're using a phase or a drummer line or any of those kind of softwares, do that on the duplicate one and then get in there and start editing. And if you want to be really careful, create a third one. Do an untouched playlist 1, secondly, phase aligned, drum aligned 2, and then a duplicate one of the phase aligned one that you then edit on. That way you have multiple ways to always go back to where you started from and you don't tie yourself in knots. We always try to do that. We'll always have edited and unedited tracks in case that we hate our editing and we want to quickly go back to the previous take. Untreated, unedited playlist. Regarding clarity, could you illustrate the conflicts that you address when trying to get clarity in a mix? For instance, accentuate them somehow so we can hear them clearly, as clear as YouTube will allow anyway. Yes, definitely, that's a great question. I think in later streaming mixes, in fact, in all my streaming mixes that we do, we always talk about those issues you're talking about. When people mean clarity, they're talking about that build-up, particularly in both the low end, where it gets built up and turns into stodge because they're not high passing effectively. So they're getting like loads of overlap of information. There's no clear kick drum. There's no clear bass guitar because there's so much going on down there. That's number one issue. But secondly, and probably most importantly when it comes to clarity, is low mids. Low mids are ugly. Now I've seen videos talking about just doing a quick cut of low mids on your master bus. That's not a smart way of doing it. It is a last resort. But if you're mixing, go in there and find the instruments where the low mid is built up. Because if you're cutting low mid at all times generically on your master bus, it's going to work sometimes when there's a huge build up, and other times it might make certain instruments sound hollow because, you know, it's not a variable percentage. It's like, unless you're using a dynamic EQ, and even then I wouldn't do it that way, but even unless you're using a dynamic EQ, for instance, to cut low mids, it's going to cut low mids consistently across everything across the board. It's a last resort. It's a way mastering engineers would think. As a mixing engineer, as a mixer, go in and find where the buildup is happening and cut those low mids. Cut those 250, 300, 400, you know, that kind of area. 350 is a very ugly area for me in drums, and I do a wide cut round there. So go in there in the drum area and pull them out the toms, pull them out the overheads, pull them out where there's a lot of buildup, kick drums, and then apply that across the board, finding buildup. So then when you come and listen to it, the master bus, you won't need to do that kind of work. It will be done for you. You don't want to be using and thinking about your master bus like a mastering engineer. That is your last resort. You're there to like add, accentuate maybe a little high end for some openness. You're there to add a little bit more thump on the overall mix on the kick drum. You know, that's what mix buses tend to do. If you're sitting there like doing tons and tons of detail work, which is okay, put the goalposts on there, figure out where that's going on, but then go and address where that's happening. Plus, frankly, you'll just become a better mixer if you spend the time finding where those issues are inside of your mix rather than trying to address them on your master bus. In what situations would you use a dynamic, condenser, or ribbon for the kick out? That's a really good question. I like condensers on the head. So if I want to get like a little bit of that bottom air, the air, that's usually and traditionally was always a Neumann FET 47. That was the most popular mic. Hundreds of sessions I've done have used that FET mic there. I found out that many large diaphragm condensers can do a really, really good job of that area. However, you can use a dynamic there. I think things like RE20s are very, very popular, and other different dynamics. Now with ribbons, I tend to use a Coles pulled back a few feet. So maybe as much as 4, 5, or 6 feet back from the kick drum, pull that back, and that is a wonderful kind of like distance kick mic. There's quite a few sessions in the Academy where you can listen to that Coles, and it's wonderful. Now, of course, you can use an AEA, you can use a Royer, there's all kinds of other ribbons that you can use. But that's always traditionally been a favorite of mine, the Coles pulled back. When mixing multiple songs for an album, how do you get them all at the same volume? I mean, ultimately, that's all about how you mix leading up to the mix bus, you know, hitting the mix bus at a certain level consistently, and then of course applying the right amount of compression, EQ, and limiting on the mix bus. And if you want, you can do the makeup gain there. But ultimately, if you can, and you have the budget, that's where a mastering engineer's job is beautiful. They can take a lot of very, very dynamic, very different sounding songs and even genres sometimes and make them feel a little bit more consistent. They're obviously not going to change the style of your music, but if there is 9 out of your 10 songs have a massive 808 sub feel to it, it might be difficult to take that 10th song that doesn't have an 808 on it and make it feel like it has a sub, but a good mastering engineer might be able to add a little bit more 20 to 40 hertz on the low end of the kick so it doesn't feel that alien. That is where a good mastering engineer will come in. You know, we've talked to a lot of great mastering engineers and we'll talk to more. They're very, very useful for this kind of stuff because they're like the last line of defense for us as producers, engineers, and mixers. They get everybody's different work. They get to work on hundreds of different genres and styles and artists, much more than we will ever do because they're just working with 2 tracks. They're not mixing like 100 like we are most of the time. So they will tell you that is their skill. Their skill is to make everything feel consistent, sonically, and level-wise, something that's competitive and works on radio, Spotify, SoundCloud, iTunes, Tidal, you name it, Pandora. That is their job, to make it fit there. So if you do have a budget, use a great mastering engineer. Otherwise, make sure your master bus is evenly printing everything from one song to another, and then take some time off and come back to all of the songs that you've mixed, and then master them in a way that reflects a consistent level between one song and another. Does the Sonarworks go on the master bus, or where does it go? It does go on the master bus. It goes on the master bus while you are mixing with your headphones, with your speakers, and then you mute it and bounce without it on. Because remember, it is allowing you to hear the music mixed in the most even possible way without the effects of your headphones or speakers. Like a lot of headphones are boom and fizz. They've got extended low end and really beautiful, shiny top end. However, you try to mix through that, you're gonna like not put enough low end on your kick, not enough low end on your bass guitar, and you're not gonna boost the high highs as much because they're already there in the headphones. So a lot of the characteristics you'll notice of the way Sonarworks is working, not on all headphones, but a lot of headphones, is it's pulling down some low end, boosting some other bits that are missing, boosting some high mids and some high end, or cutting it if it's too much in there, which it very often is. It's compensating for all of those things so it allows you to hear as flat as possible. Then when you bounce, you mute that software and it bounces the music beautifully because you have worked in the flattest possible way that you can. Hope you're all doing marvelously well. Have a wonderful time. Please let us know about your experiences with doing drum replacement. Do you work in Pro Tools? Do you do a Sound Replacer? Do you use Addictive? Do you use Slate Trigger? Do you use Superior? Do you use Easy Drummer? Are you in Studio One? Are you in Harrison Mixbus? Well, how are you working? In what DAW do you work, and how do you use it to do drum replacement? Have a marvelous time recording and mixing, and I'll speak to you soon.